seeing everybody joining the call now from Denmark and Nairobi, Kenya, the Basque Country, Portugal, South Korea, Buenos Aires, France, Kenya, Mexico, South Africa, Seoul, South Korea, Hong Kong, Panama, Romania, Manchester in the United Kingdom, my home country, Singapore, thank you for joining us. It's late there. Australia, thank you so much. You must be up late in the evening. Philippines, Argentina, Washington, D.C., Egypt, Chile, Brazil, India, Turkey, Qatar. This is a great turnout we're having today. Thank you so much for joining us from Venezuela as well, India, I see on the line, and many others joining this important conversation. Damola from Nigeria, thank you for joining us. And we'll just wait for a moment before we start at the top of the hour to let others join and get ready for this important discussion. Chile is on the line. I see Paraguay and India again. Thank you for joining us from Asia. We're always happy to have colleagues from Asia join us. Indonesia, that's in the evening your time. Thank you for joining us. Romania, Oxford in the United Kingdom, I guess. Kenya, Colombia, Peru. This is a very good turnout. We're always so pleased to have people join us from all over the world for these important UN Global Compact Academy sessions. I see Austria on the line as well. Thank you for joining us from Europe, and we'll start in just a moment. So it's the top of the hour. Hello, I'm Dan Thomas, the Chief Communication Officer from the United Nations Global Compact. Welcome to this final session in our weekly series of the UN Global Compact Academy on uniting business to respond to COVID-19, which precedes our Leaders Summit, which is coming up in 2 weeks' time on the 15th and 16th of June. And I hope all of you online will join us for that important gathering. We have over 9,000 people registered to attend that 26-hour Leaders Summit, and I encourage everybody on the line to find it on our website, unglobalcompact.org, and to register. It's free to all UN Global Compact participant companies and all their staff. So this is our 16th session since April the 2nd. We've had more than 20,000 people join us from 87 countries. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation today. I'd like to welcome our speakers for today's session. John Brandolino is the Director of the Office of Treaty Affairs at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, where he oversees UN-mandated policy processes related to drug and crime issues and technical assistance centers relating to addressing corruption, organized crime, money laundering, cybercrime, and terrorism. Marjorie Krause is the founder and executive chairman of Apco Worldwide, a global advisory and advocacy communications consultancy headquartered in the United States in Washington, D.C. She founded Apco in 1984 and has transformed it from a company with one small Washington office to a multinational consulting firm in major cities throughout the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And last but by no means least, Uto Ukpana is the company secretary for MTN Nigeria Communications PLC, one of Africa's largest providers of communication services, connecting over 68 million people in communities across the country. And as company secretary, Ms. Ukpana provides administrative and governance support for MTN Nigeria and the MTN Foundation and other entities within the MTN Nigeria group of entities. Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion about how businesses and governments can ensure greater accountability, integrity, and transparency in their response and recovery efforts, and how these efforts will build resilience. These are critical issues, particularly in our age of hyper-transparency, where the dissemination of credible information and public trust in the ethical leadership of businesses and governments is more important than ever. In response to COVID-19, the Global Compact has issued a special appeal calling on businesses to use the 10 principles of the Global Compact as a guide for recovery and to build trust through communications and policies that are consistent, inclusive, and transparent. These themes are embodied in Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. I'd like to get us started by asking each of our panelists to briefly share, where are you joining us from? What is top of mind for you today in responding to this global health crisis? And perhaps you can also touch on what I'm sure is on many people's minds, the tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and events unfolding across the United States and other countries too. So why don't we go first to Nigeria, to Uto Ukpana. Uto.
Thank you very much, Dan. And as you mentioned, I'm joining from the energetic and dynamic city of Lagos in Nigeria. And there's so much energy and dynamism here in Lagos that you wake up and you just want to go out, which has been a challenge for most during the pandemic. And unfortunately, overnight at midnight, the numbers just went up in this beautiful, bustling city. We've now recorded over 5,135 confirmed cases in Lagos. So Lagos is essentially the epicenter of the pandemic in Nigeria. And we've lost about 55 Lagosians to this pandemic. And so it really breaks my heart when you look at those numbers, particularly, as I mentioned, with the energy that is really associated with life in Lagos. And what this means for me is that everyone who has lost family, friends, my heart really goes out to them at this time. Also, we have to celebrate our healthcare workers who have been at the front lines of this, going out every day to save lives and putting their own lives at risk as they do so. But what it brings to our mind is the importance of community and trust. Because as we have seen, as this pandemic has unfolded, that we all need to brace together, whether for us this means ensuring that we make sure that we prioritize the health and safety of our employees, in fact, our incredible and amazing employees. Because as an ICT company, we've had to provide the services that keep our subscribers connected to their loved ones, ensure that children are consistently learning by providing those virtual learning platforms for them, and also ensure that members of the public we communicate the health and safety protocols, working with the Nigeria Center for Disease Control to make sure members of the public are aware of what they need to do, responsible behavior to ensure that they're safe, and they also keep their families safe. And I believe that particularly in countries like ours, where the informal sector is really significant, it presents a greater concern, particularly at this stage of community spread. When you look at Nigeria, 65% of the informal sector accounts for the Nigerian economy. And what this means is that people have to go out every day. There are those who, if they don't go out on a daily basis, they can't put food on their tables, they can't feed their families. And at this stage, it is important that we communicate deliberately the essentials of going out, staying safe, washing your hands, using alcohol-based sanitizers. People like us are fortunate to work for a company like MTN that understands this and ensures that its employees are protected, and also through the Yellow Hope package has introduced and deployed interventions that actually reach the most vulnerable members of our communities. And so if I give an example, on the 31st of March, we introduced the 10 free SMSs every day. And because most people do not have access to data services, so this is very important for them to stay connected. And in the first 8 weeks that we deployed this, we realized that over 2 billion SMSs have been sent, and which is about, the value is about equivalent of over $22 million in value.
Wow.
And so for us, this is very important. And there are also other interventions under that Yellow Hope package. Going down to the unfolding events in the US and of course all over the world, but particularly the violence in the US has taken center stage in the news recently. I want to say that human life is sacred. Life is sacred. And it's important that we all understand that life is sacred. What this has done is, again, to project how important it is as businesses, as individuals, to respect and the need for tolerance. I particularly want to refer to the UN Global Compact principles because principles 1 and 2 address the need for businesses to ensure that they respect human rights and that they are not complicit in human rights abuse. And this is when you go down all the 10 principles, they speak to the need for businesses to ensure that respect is paramount in their thoughts. And once again, my heart goes out to those who have lost their loved ones through acts of violence, hate, and discrimination, whether it is George Floyd in the US or more recently in Nigeria on the 27th of May, which is celebrated as Children's Day. A young undergraduate student was raped and murdered in a church where she had gone to study. So wherever compromises that lead to loss of life occur, it is condemnable. And governments have a responsibility to ensure that they protect lives and property of citizens. This is, again, about building that trust and community.
Well said. Thank you so much for that, that insight and that comment. Margie, over to you. Where are you speaking from today? What is top of mind for you? Oh, we need to unmute you. You're still on mute.
I will take care of that. Is that better? If I tell you where I'm sitting, you'll know what's top of mind. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., which is our corporate headquarters, and it's been my home for the last 50 years, and where I started my company, which is now all over the world. And so what's top of mind is the terrible and unspeakable tragedy that is happening all around us, the confluence of things. And maybe to give people a perspective of what it's like being here, especially I'm the child of immigrants, living in a place where, you grew up thinking that anything is possible, and that the values of society support the individual and the opportunities that should be available to those individuals. And then to see first, I grew up in the 60s, so I have seen what racial intolerance has done before. And, we all kind of thought we had at least gone somewhat past this, even though we knew we had problems. But I think there's been a confluence of events that maybe any one thing could have maybe been overcome, but the confluence, you have a population that just lost 100,000 people to the virus. You have, I think, a lot of fear from people who were suddenly sent home and told not to go out, which is so different from anything we've ever experienced. And our city centers were totally empty, and people were generally compliant, and that was all a good thing. We had a lot of different experiments going around because there was no really a lot of central guidance. So each state had to fend for itself. We had some of the most sophisticated medical facilities overrun. And, when you talk about trust in institutions and you talk about how you fit into all of that, I think it undermined a lot of the sense of security and trust that people had, both in government and in these institutions that they came to rely on. And then you kind of add to that. So then you have people who are just this week in Washington. We were just opening up, and people who had businesses were celebrating the fact that you could eat outside. You could actually see other people in a limited way when this tragedy happened in Minnesota. And I don't think there's anybody in law enforcement or anywhere else who condones what happened. There's universal horror about what happened and what it symbolizes. But the tinderbox it set off both in the U.S. and around the world is only understandable when you take the confluence of the built-up frustration and anger that came around the COVID situation, and you combine it with this terrible injustice. Because as we learned more about the virus, we also learned that it disproportionately affected minority communities, that it brought to light a lot of the underlying neglect, I'd say, a medical neglect that became, that caused some of this. And then the extreme differences between people who could afford to stay home or had jobs where they could stay home, and those on the front lines who really saved the day and were the heroes of the hour, but also put themselves at risk. I think that the combination of those two things just set something in motion. And so violence erupted, which is still not under control.
Still ongoing, yes.
It's still ongoing. And so, I think the way it relates to this conversation today, I think that the what's interesting about it this time, as opposed to in the past, I think, is that because we had this collective experience of the COVID situation, I think there is a lot more empathy for what has happened in the tragedy surrounding George Floyd. And it's almost become symbolic in a lot of ways to this whole question of how we create a more equitable society, but also this whole idea that no one is above the law, and so that even the police on the one hand, and then that's been kind of used by some in leadership that would say that would use that on the people who were protesting. And it's that most of the protests have been remarkably restrained, and but what you see is the violence of the few, and not the concern and the activities of the many.
Yeah.
So
I think you're absolutely right. It's kind of, we're in a situation where a mirror has been held up to us, a mirror to look at our own behavior, the way we treat each other, the world, the way we deal with our health, and now this systemic issue of racism that's been so clearly shown to us. But
there's just one last piece that I would just add, and that is because I'm here as kind of a more maybe on the business side, although obviously I'm not the only one. But I think that what's happened now is that all of us have been asked to kind of look inward too. And I think they're both for our clients and for ourselves, everybody is asking, what can we do and what should we do? I have a very diverse workforce. I think that it's really incumbent on all of us to have the kind of opening and trusting conversation, making at least one place safe to have these discussions. And I think that at the end of the day, actions will speak louder than words, and that it's important for us to think about. I've always been a believer that you only control the world around you. You can't do anything for, at least directly, for the larger world. Every little action adds up to big action. So you have to be a model of behavior yourself.
Thank you.
And so, I think each person running a company is asking the same questions. And hopefully because there's a big void, and hopefully responsible business can step in under the guidance of a lot of what the Global Compact stands for.
Yeah.
And provide that level of radical transparency, and can look at our values and convert that into something meaningful as we go forward.
Thank you, and that is why we've pointed to the 10 principles of the Global Compact as as a North Star, or a sort of guiding force for business leaders to follow in this very difficult, very unusual time. John Brandolino, where are you from? Where are you speaking from today? And what is top of mind for you? Oh, you're on mute as well, I think.
Now, here I am. Thank you, Dan, and it's a pleasure to join you all here. I'm actually joining you from beautiful Vienna, Austria, which is also the headquarters of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is my organization. It's also a crossroads of diplomacy and multilateralism, and in Europe and for the world. We are doing actually quite well here when it comes to the COVID crisis. Just the other day, they only reported an additional 5 cases during the day in the entire country of new infections. So the Austrians have really done a great job in really handling the crisis. And so we here, and I do hope that others will, and I trust that others will get to that point in the next weeks to come. We're starting to think now about post-crisis. So I wouldn't say post-COVID, because I think it's going to affect us for some time for various reasons. But we're trying to be able to see outside the lockdown and see what's happening, how things are developing in society, just internationally, and really from that perspective, I think we have some things to share relating to this particular webinar and the topics that you've put in front of us. We also happen to be, UNODC happens to be the guardian of the UN Convention Against Corruption. It's the only universal and most comprehensive set of international treaty commitments related to corruption. And so, not surprisingly, when we see from here that the IMF has estimated that there's been over $8 trillion has been allocated for fiscal support globally related to the crisis, amounting to 9.5% of the world's GDP. And we hear from others in the UN, for example, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, that we'll need economic aid packages of the trillions if we want to curb the pandemic's disastrous effects in many developing countries. And from past experiences, we have seen, and it's developed great concern, that these unprecedented amount of resources may not reach their intended beneficiaries and purposes. And so, as you can see, corruption is very much on our mind. I will just comment briefly on the situation in the US. I won't talk about the US situation particularly, because it is very complex, and I won't get into the details. I'm sure we could talk about it for some time, but just in general, moving away from that. I mean, we at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, we're working with those in the criminal justice sector from all over the world. We have operations in over 70 countries. And I will say that we always look at criminal justice and the systems in these countries, being the UN, as you know, Dan, we look at it from the different pillars of the UN, the different main purposes of the UN. So from a security perspective, of course, that's a main goal of criminal justice systems, to provide security to societies and people. We also have development, so sustainable development, and we've seen through the sustainable development goals that the criminal justice system and the rule of law are key, or the foundations actually, with SDG 16 and other SDGs. You see very clearly for the first time in development speak that these are very basic things you need to address and have to make societies functioning, but also to make development sustainable. And there's also the human rights aspect, another part of the UN's main mission. And that also needs to be something that's integrated into everything we do, including in the criminal justice sector. So when you don't approach it from all these angles, when there's, I think you need to develop criminal justice systems that are not only functioning and well-resourced. You can have a functioning and well-resourced criminal justice system, but if you not taking into account all these areas and ensuring that you have a kind of comprehensive look at how your criminal justice system works, then you may find that there may be issues and problems, and things need to be adjusted or tweaked or wholesale dealt with. So we deal with these issues every day in criminal justice systems in different contexts all over the world.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you all for those initial responses. Now we've got a number of questions that we need to get through, and to get through some of the audience's questions as well. So I'm going to ask you all a question, and hopefully you can give us a short answer in a couple of minutes. Marjorie, first of all, for you, we're in an age of hyper transparency and dissemination of information. As a top advisor to companies, governments, institutions around the world, tell us a bit about how leaders should behave to build trust in the public and private sphere. How important is credibility and transparency in terms of communications?
Well, I think there's probably nothing more important than that. I think from the very beginning, I think it's really important that leaders find a way to communicate so that they're building trust. I think this radical transparency is important. I think it's based on values, though, and I think that one of the most important things is for a company to have values and clearly make sure that the people coming to that company know what those values are. And John, to your point, I've done a lot of work on anti-corruption, and I think if it starts at the top and you have to make it very clear what's tolerable and not. I think you have to have constant communication when you're going through a crisis like this, not so much as a cheerleader, but as a trusted source of information. And even if you don't know all the answers, to be out there, making sure that your teams know that what are facts, what you don't know, what's going to happen, and create a level of certainty so that they're following, they know what to expect and they're following it. And I think at this time, one of the things we've been very focused on, especially until the events of the last few days anyway, is helping companies think about how they come back stronger. And in that, there was a real focus on the whole idea of how capitalism needs to change and and think about this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism and how their work can and how their profits get distributed so that not only shareholders benefit, but the society at large. And there are 3 or 4 companies that that we've been working with directly that are taking to heart the fact that there's a lot to do, and coming back stronger is a matter of putting those priorities in order. And just one last thing I would say is that my philosophy and the philosophy of our company, which affects the way we talk to our clients, was built on this idea of kind of roots and wings. I just wrote a book about this, which I take from motherhood, really, that there are only two lasting things of value you give your children. One is roots and the other is wings. So it's about values and then the spirit to use those values within a framework where it's very clear what's expected. And so that's kind of what I think we all bring to business too, is that making sure there's a strong fundamental belief system in what the company stands for, what it's about, why it's in business, and then to take that to the society at large in terms of how you do your business and operate accordingly. So transparency and I think authenticity are really the coin of the realm.
Thank you. Thank you. John, how does the UN system view the importance of maintaining accountability, integrity, and transparency during this crisis? And what's your advice to companies in terms of what specific issues they should pay attention to, how they should respond to those issues, how they should interact with governments and aid agencies?
Thank you, Dan. Well, of course, these values that you mentioned, accountability, integrity, transparency, they're of course important all the time and even outside a crisis situation. But in times of crisis like the one we're seeing, particularly economic crisis, these principles become even more important to sustainable recovery and to moving forward. As I mentioned before, insufficient accountability and oversight mechanisms in the allocation and distribution of emergency response and economic stimulus packages, for example, increase the risk of corruption and fraud and endanger the desired impact of those measures. And many of those measures are targeted at vulnerable populations, the elderly, people with disabilities, unemployed, many people lacking access to social and public services. So the effect of corruption that prevents these measures from reaching these beneficiaries is even more tragic. And the private sector itself suffers from this because, when, for example, when small and medium size enterprises cannot receive government contracts that are manipulated due to bribes or other connections, when companies and professions and industries are hit hard by the consequences of the pandemic, find themselves losing out on the recovery efforts. We've been seeing the threat of organized crime to the private sector. These groups are using the crisis as an opportunity to raise their profiles, and particularly among those in need. You see aid packages with the names of organized crime groups on them, for example. And we're seeing in some areas that organized criminal groups are trying to replace state interventions and using criminal methods to profit from large public inflows and trying to usurp the space for legitimate business. So the consequences are dire, potential consequences. So what would we recommend? Well, a lot of what we recommend is I would say for governments is similar to what we would recommend to the private sector. Building and improving comprehensive auditing, oversight, and reporting mechanisms. So for the private sector, the role of compliance officers are much more crucial than ever. Engaging in greater participatory decision-making and public consultation, involving beneficiaries in those consultations. And I think business associations and chambers of commerce should be involved in these discussions, but also they themselves within industries need to make those moves themselves, to try to have more dialogue among them, to make sure that they can provide examples for the community and try to kind of provide examples for in the group setting of those that will do things the right way, that will show integrity, that will be an example. Companies should provide better, consistent information on costs of products and services, obviously, to avoid price gouging, which we've seen in a number of areas, including in medical supplies and other types of needed goods and goods in demand during the crisis. And also establishing and reinforcing reporting and whistleblowing, which is very important, ensuring that whatever mechanisms we have for this, are robust enough to protect the identity of those reporting. And then finally, I'll just mention the concept of open data, which is very important not only for governments and for transparency and integrity, but also within industries that can be prone to corruption and manipulation. So we've seen some interesting developments in that area in the last 5 to 7 years, and I think we need to do more in that area.
Thank you. Uto Upana, the COVID-19 crisis has shocked the markets, disrupted operations, arguably resulted in significant pressure being placed on corporate ethics and compliance programs. How are you seeing this play out in terms of the practical realities of companies operating in an ethical and compliant way in this time of insecurity and uncertainty? And how do you see MTN being able to ensure trust across employees, suppliers, and your customers?
Thank you very much, Dan. Once again, it's important that every business now, what COVID-19, what this pandemic has taught us is that we need to be prepared at all times. The pandemic has not only disrupted operations, it's also disrupted the way we think and the way we will do things going forward. And there are certain key pillars that are very important at this time for a business such as ours. One is strong leadership, leadership that champions a culture of accountability, candor, transparency. And this is both the board, management, and this must cascade all the way down. Because at this time, there's so many things that could go wrong, as we have seen. And based on that as well, it's important to have a dedicated business continuity team. One of the things that we did early on before the lockdown measures were announced was to ensure that throughout the cycle, because today it's COVID-19, tomorrow there could be another crisis that disrupts business and could even disrupt business even more than what we've seen, hopefully not. But the important thing with business is you must be prepared. And what a dedicated business continuity team does is that it looks at all scenarios and does a scenario planning. And you're able to, during times where there's no crisis, to simulate what could happen and communicate throughout the enterprise what people need to do, who are the who has responsibility for what, who needs to be where at what time. And so once the business is prepared, then it's a bit easier to deal with the crisis as it unfolds. And so for us, before the lockdown was announced, we had actually started phased telecommuting within the business. And so once the lockdown was announced, we were able to transit seamlessly. And it was important that we do this because the health and safety of our employees, their families, our subscribers is always paramount, is always top of mind for us. And also in terms of that, as I mentioned, preparedness is key, because even through the supply chain, hand-holding, because without our supply chain, we don't have a business. And they're very critical, particularly at times where, for instance, some of our subscribers do business on a cash basis. And so they need to actually walk into a store to buy airtime, and they're unable to, these are not people who are comfortable with our virtual channels. And so we had to make sure that these channels were open. And so our supply chain is very critical. And also our supply chain knowing that we're in this together and we're good together. Crisis or no crisis, we must collaborate, we must partner together. And as I said, we must make sure that our supply chain is, we have a sustainable supply chain to be able to exist as a business. And also moving forward is that we also need to be sure that there's effective communication. Marjorie spoke about this, particularly with employees. At a time of a crisis, people are worried what will happen to their jobs, how's the business doing, what's going on in the world around them, what's going on are there, particularly the frontline staff, whether they're in customer service, whether it's the technical staff, what do they need to do? How can they access the right protective personal equipment that they need to do? Do they have the tools to work remotely effectively? There's so many questions. And it's important that businesses are very transparent, because that's how you build trust. It's better to at least tell your employees when you're not sure, you tell them you're not sure. Your investors also want to know how the business is doing, particularly at this time and post the pandemic. So I do reiterate Marjorie's point that communication is important at every stage. And I just want to emphasize that during the pandemic is not the time to prepare. The wrong time to prepare is when a pandemic has unfolded. And so proactive preparedness is very key and essential.
Well, it sounds like you guys had in MTN had some some good preparations for this specific situation. So congratulations on not being caught out in the way that many others were. We know that we'll continue to face shocks to our systems from climate, humanitarian, political, and social crises. We're dealing with those in this country, particularly right now. The news each day shows governments moving away from multilateralism at a time when we feel we need it most. So our global responsibility to build back better highlights the importance of realizing the SDGs, goal 16 of the SDGs, which includes advancing peace, justice, and strong institution, arguably serves as the foundation to achieve this end. Through this lens, how can governments and businesses build resilience? John, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Dan. And I think, as you said, many of the businesses, governments, are really have their hands full at the moment. So we need really to take an academic view of this, because I agree that we really need to be really prepared for the next crisis. And we've had such crises in the past. For example, we've been looking at other past crises, and we've seen, frankly, similar challenges, some that are not unique to the COVID crisis. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita in the US, the US Government Accountability Office estimated that improper and potentially fraudulent individual assistance payments were between 600 million to 1.4 billion. It was huge. So we can look at these crises to see what went wrong, but also what was done right. And we're trying to do, at UNODC, we're trying to do some of that. For example, good practices. We're seeing some really interesting things happening. And I think it's also an opportunity for governments to try new things, just as it's been an opportunity, for example, for the UN to try new things, to try to see how multilateral diplomacy can continue in an age when people are locked down. We've done some really innovative stuff. Same with government, same with businesses. For example, one country, they set conditions for procurement, and verified suppliers were registered in a publicly available framework agreement. So they've set up these institutions where then they were able to quickly check suppliers and procure what they need without concerns about price gouging or falsified products. We have another country that's had basically developed a system to look at beneficial ownership of companies to ensure that who they're dealing with and who's getting involved in a lot of these major contracts, that they're not just shell companies, or that they're legitimate companies or have legitimate basis. We also have national public procurement agencies, ensuring that certain procedures are in place to make sure that procedures are as transparent as possible. We have open contracting. We're seeing, for example, in one country, all the contracts must be reported and published in full within 1 day of signing, which is interesting. and civil society organizations are then able to track the problems of essential supplies or checking the price of tests, COVID-19 tests, things of that nature, so they can kind of follow where the money's going to, what's being done with it. And digital platforms too, as I mentioned, something that's being done generally, we're kind of developing and getting used to. And the same we're seeing in, to issue e-passes, permitting internal movement relating to lockdowns. And also those things are used also to decrease corruption and increase transparency. So we've seen a lot of different things. We've also seen, of course, practices that aren't so good, but I'll end on a positive note and just mention some of the good practices, but there also obviously are bad practices. We need to really be aware of all of them so we're ready next time.
Thank you. Uto Pana, through this lens, how can governments, do you think, governments and businesses build resilience? How are you doing that in Nigeria?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, Dan. And early on, when this, in the course of the crisis, businesses and governments had to come together. Because as stakeholders, they needed each other. I mean, no one really at the time, and I don't think anyone fully really understands the virus even till now. And so to work through this, businesses and the government had together. First, in terms of communication, this is also an environment where it is so important to get the, this communication out to people. And so proactive planning between, I must commend the NCDC, which stepped up, and really took charge of efforts in the country, whether it was in terms of briefing the population, whether it was in terms of reaching out to businesses, and also businesses reaching out to the government agencies, particularly the NCDC, to see how they could work through this period. But one of the things that that is clear as a result of this pandemic is the fact that we need to think differently. And so when we think about reintegration of the workplace, we actually need to think about how do we reintegrate properly. Resilience is all about how do we continue to perform when there's a crisis. And so how do we make sure that when we go back to the workplace, it's safe to do so, considering the vocabulary, the number of words and phrases that have been added to our vocabulary as a result of this pandemic. I mean, prior to this pandemic, none of us had heard of social distancing. None of us were thinking about face mask as something that was essential for our safety. None of us was even thinking about the word lockdown. And so these are words that we need to take into consideration to ensure that we build that resiliency. Also, the need to build alliances, both internally and also externally. So in terms of the synergies, in terms of cross-functional synergies that are needed at any time of a crisis, whether it's your human resources, whether it is your IT team, whether it is your network team, particularly for businesses like ours, where we were declared an essential service and we had to keep the country connected. And so it's important that these synergies are harnessed. And of course, the external alliances with government and its agencies to ensure that we work together to go through these sorts of crises. And in the aftermath, there are lessons to be learned. Businesses and governments will have to relook how they handle the crisis. What can we learn for the future? What are the things that we learned from other businesses, other countries? What did we do well? What didn't we do so well? So there's a whole bouquet of activities that need to happen in the aftermath of this crisis. But like I said, always in terms of proactive thinking and planning. And COVID-19 has taught us that it's important to actually think on our feet as we progress into the future.
And to learn the lessons that we're learning the hard way right now. Marjorie, how can governments and businesses build resilience? Do you advise the businesses that you work with to talk to governments? What's your opinion?
And we also work with governments in terms of their relationships with business. So we're involved a little bit on both sides of that. But I think there's an interesting dichotomy here that we really have to watch out for. On the one hand, I think moving up to the pandemic, the natural instinct of these businesses after all these years of globalization was to either nationalize or regionalize. And I think governments were contributing to this, creating immigration issues, closing boundaries, just a lot more move to nationalism. And the businesses as a result were kind of rethinking supply chains and making some decisions about bringing things closer to home, and technology was enabling that through 3D printing and some other things. And I think that was, and I think that's a trend that's going on, and people are looking at that. And then the pandemic came, and I think if anything was a wake-up call about was a poster child for the need for multinationalism or multilateralism, it was the pandemic, because things like a pandemic or a disease or a virus don't stop at borders. And as we're learning, either does violence. These things have contagion that go way beyond a given country or a given company. And so I'm hoping, and I think that out of all of this, a lot of times out of crisis comes your best thinking and your best new ideas and opportunities. And I think to mirror a little bit of what Uta was just saying, I think that companies will have to rethink a lot of how they've done business in the past, not just whether people work from home or not, or how they relate to government, or whether they move away from their global supply chains, but also how they form different kinds of alliances and partnerships to address some of the issues that maybe business would have done alone. And I think we're going to see some very interesting alliances, just in terms of vaccines, business-government partnerships. Government maybe has resources, but maybe doesn't have all the know-how or the distribution channels. And then business may have the opportunities, but not have all the capital. And I think, and then there's the whole idea of the, last mile distribution, which NGOs play a big role in, and education. So I think what we're going to see ahead is that as the opportunity here for a lot more opportunities to be, I think resilience will come from rethinking how we take advantage of a multi-stakeholder environment. And the UN obviously can play a role in that, and the Global Compact does.
Well, thank you, Marjorie, and thank you all for this discussion. I've been taking a few notes, and just to summarize some of the things that we've learned, we've talked about. It's clear that there's such an importance in trust between businesses, the community, governments. Are we seeing more empathy among people? People asking, what can we do? What should we do? Transparent communication, so important, based on values. The 10 principles is the values and the principles that we at the UN Global Compact recommend, but values so important in this conversation. Innovation is clearly key. We need to learn the lessons, the good practices. We need to identify those learn the lessons that we've been learning. Really important need for strong leadership, not just at the top, but throughout organizations and governments. We need to be prepared at all times. And how important it is to think differently, and for businesses and governments to come together to communicate and to, figure out the best way out of these crises. But out of these crises come potentially some of our best thinking, and obviously a very strong opportunity to learn the lessons from the situation we've been in, make sure that we can build back, we can recover stronger, recover better, recover together. Those are all themes of our Leaders Summit coming up on the 15th and 16th of June. And as Marjorie said, violence and pandemics don't stop at national borders. So that's a key consideration. This discussion has been a great segue to our Leaders Summit. You can see it on the screen in front of you. We'll be talking about strengthening our institutions, our commitments to multilateralism, and how to ensure that we meet the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals at that 26-hour, 2-day summit. It's going to start and end in New York at the United Nations. It's going to go around the world, thousands of people. We've had more than 9,000 people register already. I hope you will be opening it up to everybody. We'll be showcasing the very best of the UN system as well. We have more than the private sector at that summit, all kinds of opportunities for side events, private conferences that you haven't met yet, but you might want to meet at our Leaders Summit. So I hope you'll all join us for the virtual Leaders Summit. You can, finally, just to thank our speakers, Apco Worldwide and John Brandolino from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. Thank you all so much for being part of this very interesting and rich discussion. Thank you to our audience for joining us for this conversation, and for every week joining these UN Global Compact Academy sessions. So from me, Dan Thomas in New York, thank you for joining us, and farewell for now.